I'm not sufficiently caffeinated. What am I talking about? Okay, it is March, which means we are coming out of the winter here in the Midwest and moving in towards the spring. And this is the time of year where a lot of my job consists of dealing with any number of things that can be caused by the changing of the seasons, changing of humidity, and chief among them is what I would call fret sprout. Well, a lot of people call it fret sprout. But essentially, what happens is if you have an unfinished open grain wood, like a rosewood, ebony, or in some cases, in this case, Ferro, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, laurel, and hardy handshake. The issue of fret sprout happens when the wood is at a certain state, when it's adequately humidified, and that's whenever it's been fretted. But then as the seasons change, as it gets colder, as it gets less humid, and more specifically, as you start using your home heating system, your HVAC is pumping a lot of dry air, what will happen is the wood of the fretboard is going to start to shrink up, and these frets are going to stay the same. Therefore, on either side, on these edges here, you now have little hitchhiker thumbs, little bits of metal that come out and can make it rather uncomfortable to play. In some cases, can even like cut you. It's no bueno. And when I've worked for retail shops, oftentimes I'll just have 12 or 15 or 20 of these things all lined up, needing this procedure to knock down these fret edges. So fret sprout can happen with just about any unfinished porous grain wood, sometimes even with like finished maple, but it's particularly prominent with Ferro and a couple of other cheaper rosewood substitutes. And I used to sort of tell my customers to just avoid it like the plague. This is the only thing I have that has Ferro on it, and it developed so many issues over time that I kind of just told people to avoid it. But what seems to be happening is that over the years, having had this for 3.5 years or so now, it seems to have mellowed out a little bit. Fret sprout has occurred yet again. This will be the second or third time I address this issue, but it seems to be less prominent, and the wood itself seems to have sort of darkened. It's stabilized in its color. It's less gritty and grainy and gross to play. So that leads me to believe that these issues aren't necessarily as intrinsic to Ferro as maybe I initially thought. I think it has much more to do with these manufacturers being a little bit impatient when they go to start making fretboards. I don't think they spend the time necessary to let them dry, to let them stabilize, to even kiln dry them or anything like that. And so I think a lot of these issues can just be chalked up to using wood that's a little too green.
These frets are protruding enough to be visible to the naked eye, but for the camera I'm just going to run a piece of cloth up and down the edges a few times. As you can see, this neck is pretty unplayable. I clean the fretboard with some naphtha and start shaving off the exposed tangs with a 6-inch file. It's important to note that the teeth of the file ride along a level plane and only cut against a high spot. I know it looks like I'm just hacking away, but as long as I take my time and know when to stop, the finish should be more or less untouched. Now I move on to a file with a finer cut to remove any sharp burrs left behind by the bastard file. Next, I establish the bevel. And round the edges to be as comfortable as possible when moving up and down the fretboard. I've found that moving through the steps in this order requires very little sanding in the final stages. Each pass thoroughly removes the file marks left behind by any of the previous steps. What little sanding I am doing is just to remove any stray tooling marks in the finish. I just take a few delicate passes with 600, 800, and 1200 grit paper on a foam sanding block. And move on to a fine nail buffing block. At this point, I'll buff the tops of the frets as well. I condition the fretboard with lemon oil, and this board is pretty thirsty, so I give it multiple applications, with about 15 minutes in between. The wood will tell me when it's had enough. There'll be little beads of oil that start to form on the surface. Once I've wiped away the excess, I'll let it sit for a little while. The wood will continue expanding while the oil penetrates through it thoroughly. Now everything is smooth and shiny, and the Ferro has taken on a much richer, darker look.
Oh. Yep, that sucked. Oh, boy. Oh, bummer. Oh, bummer.